Super. Yeah, that's fun to keep track of 2 mailboxes. Okay. Jason, I think you can go ahead and move over. Hopefully one of your many co-chairs will take the lead and you can email Anne and Abigail and Rounaq and Nikhil. And Nishat, guess what? You may be presenting in a moment here. So Jason, thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe if Nishat, if you want to start out, then Hanya or Sagoon, if you can send an email to the other speakers to remind them.
Hello.
Hi, Nishat. How are you?
Hi. Hi. So, yeah, I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Go ahead and share your camera if you have enough bandwidth, and go ahead and share your screen. We're going to go in with hers first.
So, I have uploaded the recording in the Google Drive. So,
you sure you don't want to do it
because my
live?
Wi-Fi network is.
Are you worried about bandwidth? So you're worried
because my Wi-Fi is. So yeah, my Wi-Fi network is very
okay. Well,
unstable here. So
I'm grabbing that file right now, Hanya. So Hanya, leave yourself unmuted and let us know if that's easy to find.
Yeah, I can have a look on her file and see.
And you and Mariam, Sagoon, you guys are still listed as co-hosts, so you can share your video if you want, and of course unmute yourselves and fill the gap that we have here. It takes a little while because what she has to do, since I don't think Nishat warned us that this was going to happen, she has to download it to her own machine first and then get it playing for us. So, hey, Mariam. Mariam, where are you right now?
I'm Iran.
Where in Iran?
Tehran.
Okay, the capital. Yeah, you guys have lots of automated speed enforcement, which is so great. I wish the US had that. You know, China probably is #1 in this, but it's such an easy application. And of course, it uses computer vision, which, you know, Chen-Yu was kind of talking about a lot of ML techniques. And of course, our keynote speaker this morning was talking about that. Or what time is it in Tehran?
It's 9:30 p.m.
Thank you for participating in the Western sessions. You probably could also be awake for the Eastern sessions. I know, you know, Jason and I were tuning in last night. So, okay. So it looks like Sagoon grabbed the recording and he's going to be able to share that with us. Is that right, Sagoon?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nishat Naila Meghna, and I'm a PhD student at Virginia Tech. Today, I'll be presenting my research on modeling mood choice behavior of post-secondary students in large metropolitan areas, a dynamic tool-based approach. My presentation will cover these following sections. Our study focuses on understanding the mood choice behavior of post-secondary students in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area through a tool-based approach. This map shows the specific areas of Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. This slide shows the total population of Canada and total population of Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and it also shows the total students commuting every day across this area, and which is 60,000 students. I mean, 60,000 students regularly commute within this area. A tour is a sequence of trips that start and end at the same location. Traditional models often overlook the complexities of these tours by using the main tour mode concept. Our study aims to capture the decision-making process for each leg of the tour and offers a more accurate understanding of mood choices. We focused primarily on tours with 2 and 3 trips, but this approach can be extended to tours with more trips. The previous researches have integrated machine learning with traditional discrete trust models to predict travel modes. However, existing dynamic discrete choice models have been used by many researchers to predict travel modes without specifically focusing on post-secondary students on capturing the complex tour combinations. Our research presents several contributions to the existing travel demand modeling literature, such as many existing mode choice models used household level data, but our study stands
you guys
out by
lose the audio
using
as
the
well?
post-secondary student population's data to understand the post-secondary students' travel pattern explicitly.
Hanya,
Generally, tour-based mode choice models
Yes.
ignore complicated
are you able to hear
combinations
it?
due to the small sample
Yes,
size.
we are.
Therefore,
Okay, sorry.
individuals' mode switching behavior within the tour is not captured properly, and the practice prioritizes only the main tour. To address this issue, our study modeled the actual tour combination without relying on any predetermined hardware rule or simplified tour mode definition. Also, our study used a dynamic discrete choice modeling approach, which optimizes individuals' all future choices while modeling their current choices. The model takes into account multiple parameters such as trip distance, cost, time, individual characteristics, and estimates trip-specific parameters for each variable. As a result, it is possible to capture the sensitivity of parameters in each trip within a tour. Though this study primarily focused on trips with 2 and 3 trips tour, it can be extended to trips with 4, 5, or higher trips tour. Tours with 4, 5, or more trips tour can be modeled by using home and work-based subtours. Additionally, even without subtours, the number of possible combinations for these longer trips is still very low and make it easier to model with the approach described in this study. Like I said earlier, that we adopted dynamic discrete choice model that optimizes future choices while making the current choice by considering the expected utility of all possible future decisions. This process actually involves several steps, which are utility function. The utility of trip mode choice depends on state variables, an attribute vector, and a random utility component with a specific variance. These state variables follow a controlled Markov process with a given activity locations and departure times. Markov transition probabilities are used to transition from one trip to another within a tour determined by a decision variable. The expected discount future utility value is calculated to understand the decision-making behavior over time. The model is considered myopic if the discount factor is 0 and forward-looking if the discount factor lies between 0 and 1. Bellman's equation simplifies the value function using assumptions of conditional independence and a multivariate extreme value distribution. The likelihood of choosing a specific mode is determined based on the utility and future expectations. The maximum log likelihood technique was used for our parameter estimation, and we used Gauss programming language to model our dynamic discrete choice model. The next few slides will discuss the data analysis of our study from survey overview. So our data source was our data source is the Student Move Toronto, which focused on post-secondary students in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. Participating institutions include 10 universities within the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. The survey was conducted in fall 2019 and released in 2020. The majority of students, over 65% actually, took 2 trip or 3 trip tours on weekdays with a focus on weekday travel patterns excluding weekends. We analyzed a subset of 2,408 students taking 2 trip tours and 1,006 students taking 3-trip tours to gain a deeper understanding of mode choice patterns. For two-trip tours, the most common combinations was transit-transit, followed by drive-drive and walk-walk. And for 3-trip tours, the most common combination was drive-drive-drive, followed by transit-transit and walk-walk and walk. This slide shows the gender differences, and the gender differences showed that female students took more trips than male students, with 65.53% of females taking 2-trip tours compared to 34.50% of males and 69.09% of females taking 3-trip tours compared to 32.11% of males. Age group analysis revealed that students aged 18 to 22 years took the most trips, followed by those aged 23 to 25 and those over 25. Students under 18 took the fewest trips. For 2-trip tours, 23 combinations were identified, with the highest mode share for transit-transit, which is 42.42%, which we can see from the graph, and the lowest was for ride-hailing and cycle, which was 0.042%. And for the 3-trip tours, we identified 55 combinations, with the highest mode share for drive, and drive, which was 22.36%, and the lowest for several combinations at 0.09%. This table shows the comparison of level of service attributes in 2 and 3-trip tours, and it shows differences in driving cost, transit cost, in-vehicle transit time, household size, number of dependent children, number of vehicles in the household, etc. The next few slides will show the model result. So for 2-trip tours, we had 2,408 observations, and we estimated 62 parameters with a rho square of 0.57, which indicate a good fit. Distance, time, and cost parameters showed negative signs, which indicated a preference for modes with lower cost, shorter distance, and less time. For 3-trip tours, we had 1,006 observations, and we estimated 64 parameters with a rho square of 0.54. It also indicated a good fit. Similar trends are observed with older female students, showing a preference for driving due to time constraints and responsibilities. International students prefer transit, cycling, and ride-hailing due to budget constraints and flexibility. Part-time students with more scheduling freedom tend to choose driving or public transit. Female students over 45 years old prefer driving due to family responsibilities and time efficiency, while younger females from 18 to 45 prefer transit, allowing for productive use of travel time. So students at urban institutes predominantly use transit or cycle due to better public transportation and high parking costs. Suburban students are more likely to use driving or ride-hailing services. Students with multiple vehicles and larger households prefer ride-hailing initially and car passenger modes later. Households with more than one dependent child often coordinate between transit, cycling, and car passenger modes. So the key findings of our study was that the travel time, cost, and distance parameters showed expected negative signs. Part-time students and those in urban institutions are flexible using both drive and transit. Students working over 20 hours a week prefer driving. Female students over 45 years old prefer driving, while those under 45 prefer transit. Policy scenario, then this is the recommendations for future research. So the future research should include tours with more than 3 trips and consider sub-tours within the main tours to capture comprehensive travel behavior. And the future research should incorporate weekend data to understand the full scope of students' travel patterns. And they should estimate more parameters related to land use and built environment to gain deeper understanding into students' mode choice preferences. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So I think we have our moderator back in our Zoom room, and these are our next presenters. Maybe I think our moderator will take it from here.
Yeah, thanks, Hania. This is Brian. Sorry everyone for the late. There's something wrong with the link. My name is Brian He. I'm assistant professor at University of Louisville. I will be the moderator of this session. So topic of our session is about like user choices and mobility. Okay, so maybe I think we can start from the first presentation. I think Dr. Brown, I see you are online. So yeah, let me quickly introduce our presenter here. So Annie Brown is an assistant professor of community and regional planning. Professor Brown's research examines transportation equity, shared mobility, and travel behavior. She holds a master from urban and regional planning and a PhD in urban planning from UCLA. So Dr. Brown, I think stage yours.
Sure, thanks all for being here. Let me share my screen and we'll kick us off. Okay, any thumbs up? Does that look okay?
Looks great.
Thanks, Cara. Okay, so thanks all for being here again. My name is Anne Brown. I'm an associate professor at the University of Oregon, presenting research shifting scooter sentiments using pilots to allay fears and ride the wave of public opinion. And this is collaborative work. I have myself, Calvin Thigpen at Lyme, Nick Klein at Cornell University, and Kelsey Ralph at Rutgers University. So I'm going to start with the motivations for this research. I'll talk about the surveys and interviews we use to answer our research questions, and then overview the findings and implications for transportation planning and practice. So this research is about scooters, but this research team was really motivated by thinking about how public perceptions and participation really shift decision-making in transportation planning and policy, especially because previous research shows that there's biases present in that public participation, which means that certain demographic groups tend to participate more in public engagement processes, and typically people who participate feel very strongly, either positively or negatively, and we're often missing that middle, more neutral or ambivalent group. And so we were really curious about trying to document some of those behavioral responses in response to policy change. Especially, again, there's mechanisms that have been documented around why we might expect change when a new policy or program, or in this case, pilot, is introduced. And in previous literature shows things like people's negativity or opposition really peaking right before something is implemented, as well as shifts once a pilot or a program or policy is enacted. So we were looking at how this how public perceptions change. And we were curious again, how do opinions evolve during a pilot program? Pilots are really common in transportation planning, and we want to evaluate this as a tool for that public perception piece. We also wanted to understand how transportation planners and practitioners make sense of public opinions and how those public opinions shift over time. What do they expect? What do they observe? And how do they incorporate this into practice? We also wanted to understand what strategies they use to successfully navigate through these changing perceptions over time. So we answered these questions by evaluating a shared e-scooter pilot that was deployed in Eugene, Oregon from July through December in 2023. And we use a combination of public surveys and practitioner interviews, both cross-sectional and longitudinal. I'll walk you through a timeline so you have a sense of when we collected data and how they all connect. But the big overview across the different sources we used, in the 4 different surveys we ultimately collected, we were really seeking information about people's overall support of the program, as well as their positive and negative attitudes about the outcomes they expected the pilot to either have in the future or be having in the present. We also collected demographic data so we could assess if and how those perceptions varied across different groups. On the interview side, we interviewed 5 different practitioners engaged in the pilot program. These were either operators, people who were responsible for shaping the pilot program and the regulations themselves, responsible for community engagement, and who were really hearing from the public both before and during the pilot program. And we interviewed these groups, these 5 practitioners twice, both before and during the pilot itself. So what is the cadence of our research design? We first started collecting data in May through July of 2022. This was the first wave of public surveys, as well as practitioner interviews. So the public surveys in this first wave, we collected through a range of methods. We did Facebook outreach, we posted the survey on the website Nextdoor. We also did intercept surveys, so actually intercepting people around the community at grocery stores, libraries, and other public spaces. The e-scooter pilot itself wasn't launched until about a year later, nearly a year later, due to some contracting delays on the city and operator side. So we had these opinions about what do people think will happen when the scooters arrive. Ultimately, they did arrive about a year later. And then 2 to 3 months later, we followed up then with those same people. So we had about 500 people in this first wave who took our public survey. About 340 agreed to take a follow-up survey. We sent text and email follow-ups to these groups and asked them, okay, scooters are here now. Now, what do you think? They were the same questions, the same perception and attitude questions, but we're now having a very different time period. The e-scooter pilot was suspended about 9 months into the program due to the operator Super Pedestrian pulling out of all US markets. So it had a bit of a shorter timeline than expected. But we took the opportunity to survey people one final time after the pilot ended. So in January 2024, asking people for reflections on those experiences. We complemented our longitudinal survey data with city survey. So we collaborated with the city of Eugene to integrate our same research questions, these attitude and perception questions, into a wider city survey. Now, this was only a cross-sectional survey, so it was a single point in time in the middle of the pilot program, but it really gave us a much broader sample size compared to the longitudinal survey. So ultimately, we ended up with 138 people who completed all 3 survey waves. 5 interviews before, 5 interviews during the pilot, and then the city survey of about 1,100 people. So what do we find? How did public perception shift over time? The first we found, which is consistent with many literatures, is that overall we saw positive shifts in public opinion over the pilot period. Let me break that down for you. This is a diagram showing those shifts. So on the left, you'll see pre-pilot surveys. So this is before any scooters were present in Eugene. The middle is during the pilot, and then the right is after. And this is overall support for the program. And what I really want to highlight just is the changing support overall. So moving from about a little over half of people strongly or somewhat supporting scooters in Eugene to about 2/3. And then correspondingly, we saw a fall in the opposition. So from about 1/3 to about 1/4 of people oppose scooters in Eugene. So again, this overall support comes from both increasing support and declining opposition. And you'll see that throughout as I break down different elements of this support for the program. So a key piece of why people's support increased and opposition decreased was that we saw direct experience really can improve views or it can sour support. So direct experience is really important for how people perceive a program. So I'm going to present some data from the city survey. So again, it's about 1,100 users, really talking about overall support. Paint this broad picture of what happened and how it really matters to, again, this use of the program. So on this y-axis, I'm showing you people who never use the scooter. That's at the top of this graph, all the way down to the most frequent users who use an e-scooter weekly or more often at the bottom. And then on the x-axis, you'll see the share of survey respondents. So this top bar, people who never used an e-scooter, we're seeing about half of people either somewhat or strongly oppose the e-scooter program and pilot in Eugene. That drops to a little over a third for people who use an e-scooter once. And as we increase use, people's opposition drops and support increases. So the more people use it, the more they support. And again, there's some different directionality you can imagine happening here, but this is a really key piece that use is tied to support. When we look at our longitudinal data, so what I just showed you is cross-sectional. When we look at our longitudinal, we see similar changes related to use. So people who used scooters more often tend to have they tend to increase their support more over time. So the blue dot you'll see in this graph is expectations before the scooters came. What did people expect? How much support did they have before a program came? And then in reality, so this is after the scooters exited, what was their support level? And then there's 3 different bars you'll see here, 3 different horizontal rows, people who use scooters more than once, and then never. So you'll see these shifting levels of support by use. And that really related to, again, getting back to this, what underlies it is how people's negative views changed and how their positive views changed. So in this middle, these red and yellow dots, this is how the views on the negative outcomes of scooters changed before the pilot was implemented compared to after. So with the exception of this once group, and I'll talk about them in a minute, people's expectations of scooters were more negative than they bore out in reality. So they thought there'd be more negatives than they ultimately thought came to fruition. The inverse was true with positive. They anticipated some positive outcomes, and they ended up seeing overall more positives than they expected. Again, the exception to this is people who tried the service once. And so these people, when we look at the corresponding city data, were people who reported having a crash or a near miss or having issues with maintenance of the smartphone app. In other words, they tried it and it didn't go so well. And that meant that their support fell, their perceptions of the negative increased, and their perceptions of positive outcomes of the program decreased. Okay, the next piece was not just direct experience, but also exposure can help allay fears. So this is people who never rode a scooter while it was in Eugene, but just seeing it changed perceptions as well, just the experience of having it in the neighborhood. So again, this is support for across age groups. And this is people who, again, before compared to after. Overall, with the exception of this 18 to 24 group, who was very, very positive overall in the beginning, most people shifted to have more supportive views after the pilot. And again, this is the last time I'll show this, but I'll show a series of overall support graphs, and you can just imagine in your mind, this is really what's underpinning those, which is falling negative perceptions. So people perceiving fewer negatives after a pilot is implemented and perceiving overall more positives. And on balance, that results in more support. So non-riders just seeing, again, the scooters help to assuage some of those fears. People who didn't plan to use e-scooters were some of the biggest movers. So this is a graph showing how often people expected to try the e-scooters once they arrived. The people at the bottom here, the people who didn't expect to try it, overall opposed the program and were some of the biggest shifters to more positive perceptions. They were very skeptical and ultimately said, you know, this isn't so bad. Still a little on the negative side, but more positive over time. The opposite was true with the enthusiasts, the pre-pilot enthusiasts. So these were people who had, up here in the corner, who had very positive perceptions ahead of time, and those were somewhat tempered by reality. So this enormous enthusiasm before kind of coming back to reality, with seeing them, and maybe they weren't exactly as perfect as people were expecting. All of that to say shows how expectations didn't always match reality for better or worse, and that people correspondingly adjust their support for a program. Okay, the next piece that our survey data really highlight is how non-users see negative outcomes everywhere. And this is a real challenge for thinking about transportation planning or policy, which is, again, this use piece and how people can experience the same program and come with fundamentally different views. And so I'm going to show you a series of graphs. This is from the city data, so about 1,100 people. And you're going to see, again, there's going to be a series of 5 bars from people who never rode an e-scooter at the top to all the way down to people who rode a few times a week or more at the bottom. Now, this is a graph showing people, how many people or what share of people reported never encountering or ever encountering bad e-scooter parking. And you'll see that it's about 80% of people who never rode an e-scooter said, yes, I've seen bad e-scooter parking, compared to about 1/3 of people who rode an e-scooter a few times a week or more. And this is this linear pattern you're really seeing with use, and this what people are reporting seeing really carries forward for a number of different topics. So encountering sidewalk riding, very similar story. Reckless riding, again, much higher. People are observing much higher when they're not using the program compared to when they're using it often. And then flipping it on its head, people said, I never encountered any of these issues. Very few people who never rode an e-scooter said, nope, no issues here. Whereas about half of people who rode an e-scooter a few times a week or more said, all good here, right? No issues. So again, just this very different lived reality for people who are walking, riding, driving, living on the same streets, experiencing the same program, but seeing fundamentally different elements or different perceptions of this program. So what did the practitioners make of all this? So first, they expected, I would say, negative opinions in the beginning. They really expected to have public concern and opposition in the beginning, given what's happened in other communities and a general reluctance that they've seen in other projects around some hesitation to change over time. So their first strategy going in with this expectation was to build trust with the community and create space for change. So they held quite a few listening sessions. They worked to incorporate community's concern into the pilot itself. Things like slow first rides to help with safety perceptions, and a variety of other elements, building some designated parking spaces around the community, et cetera. So really trying to connect with community and reflect those perceptions into the pilot program. They also systematically collected positive feedback. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the implications. But again, that city-led survey was a direct reflection of the planners, the transportation professionals, expecting only to hear from a subset of the population and trying to really engage public feedback more broadly. The third strategy they employed to kind of ride this wave of public perceptions over time was to correct any misconceptions. So often when people reached out, they had certain conceptions of the scooter pilot program, and some of those were incorrect. One of the common ones they reported hearing was people were opposed to the scooters being funded with public dollars, which they were not. And so the city staff worked to correct those misconceptions as they were brought up. The fourth strategy that was really key, the staff reported, to navigating, especially the initial skepticism or when opposition was raised, was helping leaders, in this case was really city council, ride that wave of public sentiment, really engaging with them, helping them understand what they were hearing from the public, how it related to the program, and what city was doing about it. So what do all these survey and interview findings tell us about transportation pilot programs, transportation planning and practice? First, pilot projects can be very useful for overcoming opposition. So we certainly saw increasing support, declining negative perceptions, increasing positive perceptions among a host of groups, both users and non-users, over this pilot period. At the same time, a pilot's certainly not a panacea. So we saw opposition to a greater opposition among people who used the scooters only once, which would suggest there's a need to create, again, very successful pilot programs and think really strategically about how pilots are implemented. So some lessons learned from this pilot and how to create future successful pilot programs is really creating a sense of trust and meaningful outreach among the community so that the community feels heard and that the city is being responsive to their concerns. The second, which again, this is of course always a goal, but sometimes goals come in conflict with timelines, etc. But really being cognizant that the smoothest rollout possible is the surest way to build support. So if you have a really rough rollout, you might have, you're more likely to lose support. So that's this group again that we saw in the survey data of people who tried scooters, didn't go so well, their support fell. So you want people to have positive experiences, especially even just that first time, to encourage support. The next piece was rolling out pilot programs. It's good to assess the representation of public feedback. So you might be hearing some very polarized, very positive, very negative feedback, but you're probably also only hearing from a certain select group of people. So trying to systematically survey the public who might have more neutral or not feel this fervor to reach out can help gauge overall sentiment. And that's both helpful for the city staff to adjust a pilot, but also then to communicate with these public officials to help them understand both how complaints they might be receiving are situated in the broader conversation and context, and how those evolve over time, how the city is adjusting, and again, thinking about how the public is engaging with a pilot program. So thank you, and I will look forward to questions.
And thank you, Dr. Brown, for your presentation. So just so you know, before I joined UFL, I was a postdoc at UCLA. So we do have a lot of collaboration with urban planning people. So it's really nice to see such a comprehensive analysis about like planning and policy. So any questions from our audience? If there's no question, maybe I can ask one. And just a question asking, like, I see your data is collected from like spring to winter, March to, the pilot program is from March to December, right? I'm just wondering, like, I don't know about weather in Eugene, but I just wondering, is the weather, like season, will be a factor that influence people's choice, or like a expectation, or like the changes in expectation of the real experience? Is there any like a factor from the season or weather side?
I mean, that's possible in terms of how you experienced the program. You know, I'd say more than season, it probably matters that we're a university town. And so we have a lot of students who leave during the summer, which is arguably the best time to be out and about. I mean, our original survey was in March, and it was still pretty hypothetical. So when we ultimately surveyed people, it was in the summer, but they would have had like some rainy months, some less rainy months by that June, kind of May, June, July survey period. So I wouldn't think that weather would play a huge role, in part because also people here are so accustomed to that weather, and a lot of people tend to be biking and walking around in that weather as it is. And there's a lot of infrastructure that's accustomed to being prepared for that type of weather. So I'm not sure how much of a role that played. Certainly could have, but it wasn't something we explicitly tested or controlled for, especially because it wasn't about like how many trips are you taking. It was about, do you think these are positive or negative? You know, how much do you support this program overall?
Yeah. Thanks for your explanation. I think that's good. I'm asking because, like, you know, I have done some study in Louisville, and our winter is very cold, so we see significantly difference in like the trips during like maybe fall and winter. So I'm just curious about this direction.
Sure. Yes, I think when you look at the trip making, it certainly falls in the winter. It's highest, and actually I think it's more like the fall. It's the highest. That's when students are back. The weather's still nice, but wasn't something we were looking how many. You know, when we asked people how much they rode, we said about how much did you ride over the study period or the pilot period. It wasn't how much did you ride this specific week. So I think seasonality is less likely to have impact to that.
Thank you. Okay, and let's move to our second presentation. So Abigail, I think I see you, yeah. Hi. So let me
Hello.
give a quick introduction and the floor will be yours. So Abigail is a researcher at the National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado. Her research focuses on applying computer science to problems facing our world, particularly pathways to decarbonizing the transportation sector as well as centering equity. So Abigail, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Hello. Great, looks like I'm sharing my slides. Let me know if they're not working, but looks like they are. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some data collection that we did in Laos, collecting mobility behavior data. I worked with Sebastian and Shankari on this. I'm not sure that either of them were able to make the call. We've been jumping back and forth between different groups. So the motivation for this was a need to understand mobility behavior, particularly with a changing transportation landscape, the introduction of new technology, things like electric vehicles. We really wanted to be able to prepare for and track those changes, and understanding mobility behavior data, which there's not a lot of available for Laos, for things like mode and purpose of trips, origin and destination, trajectories, really wanting this data to be able to plan for EV infrastructure, understanding where people are going, how they're getting there, where and what they're going to need to be charging, how long they're going to be there for charging, and then also to study the data in a gender disaggregated way to examine the differences between the way men and women travel and maybe what barriers or different travel needs exist. This is all sort of under the goal of being able to create clean, accessible transportation for everyone. So some of the related work that we examined found that motorcycles and cars were the most popular modes. This was found through a study that used traditional travel surveys and counting of intersections in Vientiane, which is the capital city, and where we also conducted the most recruitment. Again, other data sources finding that motorcycle and car were the main modes, or even that motorcycles were about 14 times more common than cars in some cases. And then other studies looked at infrastructure and traffic safety, again, with some of these emphasizing the role of motorcycles in that society and the safety issues that's in them. So we were unable to find existing detailed travel data for Laos, and we know traditional travel surveys people are filling out where they went and how they got there can be really time consuming and a super high user burden, whereas cell phone data, which is requires less effort for the user, can be somewhat unreliable. So what we opted for was smartphone app-based data collection with an app called NREL OpenPath, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. It is free and open source, and anyone is welcome to take a look at that. But over the period of data collection that we've conducted so far, we were able to collect around 1 million different location points from around 20,000 trips by 84 unique users. These participants were all in Laos, specifically in the capital city of Vientiane, and a lot of them were recruited from our partner organizations. So future work would include expanding that recruitment to other people. So getting in a little bit more to our app-based data collection, this app was voluntarily installed by participants on their smartphones, and the data was automatically collected in the background. So when they left the place, it started the trip. When they stopped, it ended the trip. This is all automatically processed into a travel diary, which is what you're seeing on the screen here. And then in the in-app travel diary, participants have the opportunity to label their trips with a specific mode and purpose. Those are those blue buttons that you're seeing. Can be chosen from a simple drop-down menu to sort of keep the user burden low. You're just checking boxes. And this will be higher accuracy and lower user burden in traditional surveys because we're able to collect all of the distance, location, time information completely automatically. So our recruitment process began with translating the text for the app to Lao. It was previously available and still is in both English and Spanish, but for the users in Laos to be able to access it in their language, we work with our partners to translate it to Lao and then collected an initial pool around 84 users. We were really trying to balance our data needs with the user burden, which is why we asked people to keep the app installed for just 1 month. You could keep the app installed for as long as you wanted to, but for people who are particularly wary of having a tracking app installed on their phone, limiting that to 1 month was helpful in getting people to get on board with the process. And we kept it to simple mode and purpose labels rather than attaching detailed surveys to the trips to again keep the user burden low. The different types of data collected by the app can sort of split into sense data and user provided data. So for the sense data, that's going to include things like the start and end location, the trajectory, the time, and then speed and acceleration data. This is collected with similar sensors to those that a fitness app would use to tell if you're walking or biking. And that information is processed into a sensed mode, which we'll see more of in just a minute. But basically can divide between vehicle, walking, biking, a couple of other things. And then there's also user provided data. So when the app is installed, you're asked to take a one-time demographic survey and provide information like your age, your gender, household characteristics, your occupation, things like that. And then for each trip, the users were asked to install the modes and purposes. And we did customize the lists of modes and purposes shown in the app to Laos to add things like motorcycle that may have not been common in our US collection of data previously with this app, but were really important to have there. So these early results were collected between November of 2023 and April of 2024 with two main waves of onboarding, one in November of 2023 and one in March of this year. So these are the demographics of the 84 participants from that onboarding survey that I just mentioned. There were a little bit more men than women that participated, but ages were generally well distributed with most of them between 26 and 40. And people were commonly in the larger households with around 80% in households of 3 people or more. That's that bottom left blue chart. And we can see that there were slightly more common 2-wheeled vehicles than 3-wheeled vehicles, particularly people were less likely to say that they didn't have any 2-wheeled vehicles than they were to say they had no 3-wheeled or 4-wheeled vehicles. And this is in line with the prior work that we had seen that emphasized the commonality of motorcycles. This is the sensed mode that I was talking about. So for all of the trips that are collected, even if they don't get a label from the user, their sensor information is processed into a sensed mode. You can see around 60% were in vehicle, also had walking and biking, and then a few high-speed rail or air trips. If we're going fast enough, we knew it had to be one of those. What's really important to notice here is that we can't tell in vehicle if that was, car drove alone, car with others, e-car, motorcycle. So we're really relying on the user labels to get more detailed information about what vehicles are being used. And our findings were in line with the prior work. Motorcycle was around 43% of the 3,800 or so trips that were labeled within that data collection period by 80 users, meaning there were 4 people that never labeled. That's fairly common. Gas car, both alone and with others added together, was around 20% alone and 13% other. So add those together and it's very close to car, in line with the prior work. Walking was another common mode, and it looks like men walk a little bit more often than women. Maybe women take motorcycle a little bit more often. These trends are a little bit clearer in this chart, which is showing the distribution of how often people labeled certain modes. So on the left, you can see that the median rate of taking car drove alone was around 40% for both men and women. And then towards the right-hand side here, we can see that women are taking motorcycles more often, as shown by the higher median third quartile there, and they're walking less often by men than men, especially shown by the, most of them were all walking less than 20% of their trips. So we don't know why that was, but it is interesting to notice that trend in the different travel patterns. Here we're looking at the purpose of travel that users labeled. So for those same roughly 3,800 trips from 80 different people, we're looking at the way they labeled modes and or purposes of travel, sorry. So men and women traveled a similar amount of the time to go to work. That was the most common for each of them. Men were traveling at least twice as often to school and at work than women were, which this could be just, happenstance of the sample of those 80 people or indicate different travel needs. And then on the flip side there, women were traveling more for meals and more than twice as often as men to pick up or drop off people. So again, you can see they have different travel needs and mobility behavior patterns. Once we pair this purpose data with the geospatial data that's collected, which we'll see in a few slides, we can really start to see, where people are going for work or for shopping and how long they might be spending in those places and start to draw conclusions about what might be good places for EV charging. This is looking at the trips split by gender. So all of the trips were concentrated around that capital city of Vientiane. You can see on this heat map where it's red, there were more trips that started or ended there, and then where it's green going to blue, that's where there were less trips starting and ending in those locations. These are from 16,000 trips, and so we're able to split them by gender by pairing the trips with the demographic survey associated with that user. And you can see that men on the right here generally travel a little bit further away from the city than women do, and means travel is a little bit more concentrated in the city. These are now labeled trips split by the mode they were labeled with. So on the left, these are all the trips. In the middle, motorcycle trips, we can see are concentrated around the city. And on the right, car trips, which I did add together alone with others, e-car, all of the car modes are represented here. And those tend to travel a little bit more to the north and south, which sort of makes sense. You would think that a car might be better for a longer trip than a motorcycle. Now we're seeing the trajectories split by mode. So on the left are those car trips, on the right are the motorcycle trips. And you can see again that the motorcycle trips are concentrated in the capital city of Vientiane. And also on the left here, we're starting to see sort of corridors of longer trips emerging to the north and south. Another good thing to keep in mind for EV charging. These are both motorcycle trajectories, but now split by gender. And what I wanted to point out here is that men are traveling further even within the city, particularly towards the southern parts of the city. So that's an interesting pattern that we noted in some of the very early data collection. And here's what I was talking about with pairing the purpose data with the geospatial data. We can see the destinations of around 1,200 work trips and starting to see the hotspots where people may be spending a lot of time during the day and could be a good place for charging. Just to go over some of the general conclusions we've been able to draw so far, motorcycle is the most common mode choice, around 43%, with car trips closely following 40%. This was well in line with previous work by more traditional travel survey and counting methods, so really validating here are app-based data collection methods. We noticed a lot of gender differences in the data, particularly with men traveling further than women. And this was the first data of this kind that we are aware of as captured by the app that we were using. And then again, hotspots in travel, work-related hotspots that could be good for EV charging, and then corridors of car travel from north and south, starting to learn more about those needs. The future work of this project is concentrated around continued data collection, recruitment. These charts were taken from our public dashboard for the program, but you can see just a couple of days ago, so you can see that the way the trends are already changing with car, drove alone, even overtaking motorcycle at this point. And we're now up to around 97 different users that are on board. And then on the bottom, you can see this time chart just sort of pointing out that jump in participation in November for about a month, and then jump in participation in March for around a month. And we're going to continue collecting this data with a focus on increasing the reach of recruitment and also maintaining a gender balanced data set so we can continue to compare the different travel needs of women. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Abigail, for your great presentation. And do we have any questions from the audience? No question, I can ask one. So for your data, it's good to know like we have such a good like smartphone-based location data. Just wondering like first, is this data open to public use, or like any way we can try to get collaboration to learn about the data? And second one is like, I think the data is trip-based, right? I'm just wondering like, can we get some like somehow get the trip chain data, because sometimes the travel, the interdependencies between trips will give us much more information. Thank you.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, OpenPath is open source and has been used for a lot of different studies. So this data is not yet open source, but on project conclusion, the data is published in the Transportation Secure Data Center, sort of a cleansed version of it. And then if you get access, you can, through a portal, access the geospatial data as well. So that data is published for some programs already. I believe one e-bike program evaluation in North Carolina, and then also some e-bike program evaluation data from Colorado, and maybe a couple of others. As programs are ending, we're starting to add more to that database. And yes, you definitely could use this data to look at trip chaining. We do have like all of the data for each trip, and it's associated with the user. So you could look at what the user did over the course of the day. and evaluate things that way. That's not analysis that we've conducted yet, but I think it could be really interesting.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, and thanks, Abigail. And let's move to our next presentation. Dr. Basu, you online? Yes, great.
Yes. Hi, Brian.
Yeah, hi. Let me give a quick introduce, and then you will take the stage. So Dr. Basu is a manager of multimodal planning and design at the Boston Region MPO and a postdoc associate in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. His research interests include sustainable city planning, integrated urban systems, and transportation equity. He has consulted for the World Bank on projects in Latin America. He holds a PhD degree in urban science and planning and a dual master's degree in transportation and city planning from MIT, and a bachelor degree in civil engineering from IIT Bombay with a minor in economics. So Dr. Basu, please go ahead.
Thanks, Brian. Good afternoon, evening, night, and morning to everyone who's joining us from different time zones. I'm delighted to be sharing some of the work that we've been doing on the, on the topic of pedestrian route choice and accessibility. This is a body of work that has resulted in multiple papers, and I'm going to be summarizing our findings from this entire body of work that we've been conducting over the past few years. This work is collaborative, of course, with Nico Colanino, Aziz Al-Hassan, and Andres Sepsuk from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. So when we think about major global challenges that we're facing right now as a global society, the two that immediately come to mind are climate change and social inequality. And transportation, the transportation sector is implicit in both of these challenges. When we look at greenhouse gas emissions, for example, the transportation sector, especially in the US, is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, and that stems primarily from light-duty vehicles, otherwise known as cars that we drive around, usually in a single passenger or single occupancy manner. Now, our focus on trying to cut down greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector has led to what I call carbon tunnel vision, where we are focusing almost exclusively on emissions and ignoring the other ways through which the transportation sector affects other spheres of our lives, such as public health or social inequality and so on. And when we talk about public health, of course, we cannot ignore the public health crisis that we're witnessing all around the world, but in particular in the US, where the US has been experiencing increased and rising road fatalities, very much unlike its peer countries. There's also the issue of mobility justice, or rather mobility injustice, where when we think about who's dependent on who's least likely to be able to own a car, who's dependent on public transit, who's most likely to be in danger when they're walking and biking, we see clear disparities across race and ethnic groups. There's also the concern around climate injustice, whereby we see associations between higher income neighborhoods who have access to more greenery, for example, or who have access to cooling resources such as air conditioning. And as a result, they are better equipped to manage heat waves and other extreme weather events. So all of this leads us to the need for promoting ways in which we can reduce our dependence on private automobiles. And one way to do that is to focus on active transportation, which means walking, biking, and rolling. Thankfully, over the last few years, primarily fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic, we are seeing increased attention from different levels of government. So right from the feds to states, counties, MPOs, and cities, a lot of folks are creating these active transportation plans. We have active transportation planning toolkits that are now available. And these plans don't just focus on safety. So going back to this effort around trying to reduce road fatalities and the whole Vision Zero movement that focuses on safety, there's more to active transportation planning than just planning for safety. We need to make sure that people who are walking, biking, and rolling are comfortable, that we have regional networks that connect people and provide access to different destinations that they might want to go to. However, despite these plans, active transportation related funding still remains severely underutilized and unavailable. When we look at funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law, we see that only 3.3% of the total funding towards transportation infrastructure has gone to active travel. On the right, we see this graphic that starting from 2019, the California Active Transportation Program was receiving quite a lot of requests, and there was demand for funding. However, we don't see a similar rise in the funding that was made available to them. And this recent uptake was only observed in 2023. Now, why should we fund active transportation, in particular walking? Of course, there's a sustainability argument where we can see from this graphic that walking and biking don't have any emissions associated with them. But there's also the equity argument. This is a graphic derived from data from the 2017 National Household Travel Survey in the US. And we see that half of the trips that people who live in households without cars make are done by walking and biking. And also a quarter of the trips are made by public transit, and people need to walk or bike to public transit and from public transit. And thinking about Vision Zero and safe routes to school, so this emphasis on safety and trying to make sure that people are not at risk when they're walking and biking has also been part of the equity argument. And there's significant opportunities here to convert existing trips that are made by cars to walking and biking. This is again derived from data from the 2017 National Household Travel Survey. We see that around 45% of car trips made in the US are less than 3 miles long. So if we can convert some of these trips to walking and biking, if we can provide the necessary conditions that make people feel safe and comfortable to walk and bike, so we will be able to reduce people's dependence on private automobiles. But there's a new potential challenge. Of course, there were several challenges that I touched upon, but there's a new potential challenge that's driven by climate change, and that's extreme heat. Now, there's a lot of articles out there, such as the two I'm highlighting here, that talk about how people are starting to recognize the effects of extreme heat on being outdoors and thinking about how this might affect their recreational activities like running, walking to parks or hiking. But people walk for more than recreation. Of course, recreational walking is important and does contribute to people's quality of life and mental health, but people also walk to critical destinations like community centers, like public transit, like supermarkets, and so on. So that brings us to trying to really unpack how people make decisions around walking, pedestrian route choice in particular, and how might extreme heat affect this sort of behavior. So this work is at the intersection of active transportation / sustainable transportation planning, travel behavior, and climate change, specifically thermal comfort. So when we look at the different kinds of factors that affect pedestrian route choice behavior, first of all, we need to look at the basics. We need to make it feasible for people to walk. There needs to be a network in the first place. Where does that network connect to? Are people able to access different destinations? So these are necessary conditions. And then we have other conditions that make it safer or more comfortable, and then finally make it a pleasurable experience as people are walking. So in this project, we've been looking at 2 study areas. One is San Francisco, the other is Boston, both comparatively walkable cities in the North American context. And we have been working with a data set of anonymized walking trip trajectories well over 10,000 of them after cleaning. So we started off with a raw data set of over 100,000 trajectories, went through a bunch of cleaning procedures, and these are observed trips. These are actual walking trips that people made. Unfortunately, these data sets are anonymized, so we don't know who was walking. We don't know the social demographics associated with the person making the trip. And we constructed choice sets of feasible and potential alternatives because we knew the origins and destinations. We knew how long it took them to actually make that trip as they were walking. So we constructed choice sets accordingly. And we ended up with just over 11,000 trips in Boston, just under 15,000 trips in San Francisco. In trying to explain pedestrian route choice behavior, we used the usual suspects, as I'm calling them here. These are variables that were drawn from the literature that resonate with our lived experiences. For example, route length. Most of us are looking to minimize how long we have to walk, unless there are other factors that influence that decision. We try to avoid turns because making too many turns can be cognitively uncomfortable / expensive. We try to avoid walking uphill for the most part, but we also like walking along lively routes that have a lot of storefronts on the ground floor, that have amenities, routes with wide sidewalks. And on the flip side, we want to avoid interacting with cars. So routes that are next to wide highways where there are a lot of cars zooming by at high speeds. These are not routes that are usually preferable. In addition to these, we also looked at including sky view factor and green view index, and I'm calling them modern additions because these are fairly computationally intensive to calculate, and these are based on Google Street View images. So we used computer vision models trained on Google Street View images to extract the percentage of the camera's view that would be occupied by either the open sky, which would result in the sky view factor, or greenery, which would result in the green view index. And to model this behavior, we use the path size logic model because we are trying to model pedestrian route choice. Now, the path size logic model goes beyond a traditional multinomial logic model. It's a very standard utility based framework over here, as I'm showing, with explanatory variables represented by X. Beta represents the coefficients. And we add another term, which is the logarithm of the path size factor, which accounts for the overlap between alternatives. And that's pretty standard for trying to model route choice. To summarize what we found, this was in line with our expectations. In both cities, we found that people try to minimize route length, number of turns, elevation, and interaction with automobiles. The positive effects included sidewalk width. So people like walking along routes that have wide sidewalks, lots of amenities, lots of greenery, and open air exposure had a mixed effect. It was positive in Boston and negative in San Francisco. And we took these effects and converted them to a measure that we are calling willingness to walk. Now, this is very similar to the willingness to pay measure that some of us might be familiar with, which is derived from the value of travel time. So if we were to estimate the value of travel time to be 0.25, the way to interpret that would be that individuals are willing to pay 25 cents to reduce travel time by 1 minute. And that gives us a willingness to pay of 25 cents per minute. Now, the analogy to that is thinking about this in terms of willingness to walk or equivalent walking distance. So if the equivalent walking distance is 25, or the willingness to walk is 25 meters per turn, it means that individuals are willing to walk 25 extra meters to avoid one turn. Sorry about the back and forth flipping. So how do the willingness to walk measures turn out for the two cities? So here we see a comparison of Boston and San Francisco. Number of turns, both negative as expected. People would like to avoid making too many turns, and San Francisco people walking in San Francisco have a greater aversion to the number of turns. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the Green View Index over here, where we see that for both Boston and San Francisco, even though the effect was positive, it is not statistically significant because the confidence interval overlaps with 0. And I'll come back to this in a few minutes. So we took these willingness to walk measures and then translated them to pedestrian accessibility evaluations, where we were constructing catchment areas or walk sheds around points of interest, specifically transit stations. So the easiest way to construct a walk shed is simply to draw a circle around a point of interest. That's a Euclidean walk shed. A slightly more sophisticated way to do this is to use the actual network, which would give us a network walk shed. And with the help of these behavioral effects, we can go beyond just using lengths of segments on the network and think about the different characteristics of that segment and how might that affect people's perceived distances and experiences. So that would give us a perceived walk shed. So we compared the perceived and the objective walk sheds around BART stations in San Francisco. And we found that in downtown, the perceived walk sheds were roughly about 60% of the area of objective walk sheds. And in other areas, they were much smaller, closer to 30%. But overall, the perceived walk sheds are much smaller than objective walk sheds, which means that we tend to overestimate transit accessibility if we rely exclusively on just the network length and fail to account for all of these other behavioral factors that affect people's decision-making and experiences. We observed something similar in Boston as well when we did this for MBTA commuter rail stations, and we found that perceived walk sheds were about half the size of objective walk sheds. So all of that related to mostly built environment and urban design related variables. So where does thermal comfort come into play over here? So then we added thermal comfort as an additional explanatory variable. We use satellite imagery from different times of the day and different days at a very high spatial resolution, which was 3 meters. And we looked at 2 scenarios. One was a typical summer day, and one was the hottest summer day. And these are raster files, as you can see, at a 3-meter spatial resolution. And then we translated these to thermal comfort indices, also known as the UTCI. That's the specific index we were using, the Urban Thermal Climate Index, for a typical summer day and a hot or the hottest summer day for each segment in the road network. And you can see the differences over here and the effect that the presence of different levels of urban greenery can play in affecting the thermal comfort index. So how does thermal comfort affect pedestrian route choice? First, we focused only on summer trips to see if there was an effect of the UTCI, and the UTCI has different threshold levels in terms of measuring thermal comfort, and 26 degrees Celsius is often used as the baseline. So anything above 26 degrees Celsius starts to get into the realm of heat stress with different levels. Of course, the higher up you go, the more stressed you are if you were to experience that. And we find that UTCI doesn't really have an effect on pedestrian route choice for all summer trips. However, if we were to take a subsample of the trips made during the summer, but giving people options within the choice set to choose a route that was cooler or to choose a route that was hotter based on the UTCI, which we are calling the UTCI flexible summer trips, that's when we see that the UTCI does indeed have a pretty significant impact. And that's close to 81, that's close to 101 meters on average. And if we focus only on day trips during the summer, keeping the same way of constructing those choice sets, which we're calling UTCI flexible, still remains significant. And the average value of that effect is 81 meters. Now, on the bottom left, we also broke down this effect into categories. So we have 26 degrees Celsius to 29, 29 to 32 and above 32. And we see that this is scaling linearly. So the effect is 22 meters to avoid walking an extra 22 meters to avoid a 1 degree Celsius increase in UTCI for the first category. Then it's 44 meters and then just under 66 meters. However, we didn't have enough data beyond that to be able to break this out even further. But one would estimate or guess that this is likely not going to be linear. It's going to drive up sharply to the point that it overrides the desire to walk. And once it gets too hot, people are just going to make decisions to use other modes or forego their trips or choose a different departure time when it's cooler. And how do these translate to pedestrian accessibility? Again, we use similar walk sheds. And the difference now is that, first of all, there's the geometric walk shed that's based just on network distance. And then we have the perceived walk shed using the built environment factors that I talked about earlier, but not the UTCI, which is the thermal comfort index. And then we include the UTCI to look at perceived walk sheds on a typical summer day as well as the hottest summer day. And we find that the perceived walk shed on average was around half, I had mentioned earlier, of the geometric walk shed, and that decreases significantly to just under 30% of the population that can access a transit station, considering the effect of UTCI on a typical summer day, and that decreases to a dismal 12% on the hottest summer day. And these are a couple of examples of how the built environment around different stations can affect access to those stations. So on the left, you see Newmarket, which is heavily built up, not a whole lot of greenery in the original geometric walk shed. And then on the right, you have Upham's Corner, which does have a comparatively larger amount of greenery in the walk shed. And because of that, because of how comparatively lesser built up area and the presence of greenery. So the decrease in the walk shed upon incorporation of these other behavioral factors is not as drastic in the case of Upham's Corner as it is in the case of Newmarket. And slowly but surely, policymakers are recognizing the importance of funding efforts that look at increasing thermal comfort for people who walk and bike. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Boston Region MPO was awarded an MVP action grant to work on this idea and advance it with pilot implementation of heat mitigation strategies. Quickly pivoting to urban greenery, so we adopted a similar approach. Now, instead of using the Green View Index, which I talked about earlier, we adopted another index, which has been commonly used in remote sensing communities to measure greenery, which is known as the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI. And it's at the same spatial resolution, 3 meters. And on the right, we see a couple of examples. I want to draw your attention to the example on the bottom, which is Hanson Street. And we see that there's a difference between what NDVI is showing us and what GVI is showing us. The calculated GVI is just under 0.2, but the NDVI is much higher, and it's just under 0.4. Whereas for the example on the top, Pembroke Street, the values are pretty close to each other. So there is this difference out here, and we wanted to explore this because we saw that the effect of GVI was not statistically significant, and that didn't seem to make sense to us, especially for summer trips. So we wanted to embark on this additional exploration, if you will. So apologies for not having nice graphics here. This is still work that we are looking to expand on. But the results over here, as you can see, we had 2 models, one with GVI, one with NDVI, estimated on all trips. So that was a full data set. And then we had a subset that looked that included only summer and early fall trips. That's model 3 and 4 on the right. Again, one model with GVI, one model with NDVI. And what we can see over here is that the GVI effect is never statistically significant, regardless of which subset we look at. However, the NDVI effect is showing up as significant. It's around 44 meters. That's the willingness to walk value for trips made during the whole year. And that's slightly higher. That's 52 meters for trips made during the summer or early fall. And similarly, constructing those walk sheds, combining UTCI and different levels of urban greenery using NDVI, we found that if we were to look at hypothetical scenarios of expanding greenery, of continuing to increase the amount of greenery that we have, it can counteract the effect of heat stress and extreme heat to a certain extent. So we can see that on a typical summer day, at current levels of greenery, the walk shed shrinks to 28%. But if we were to double the amount of greenery based on current levels, we could get it up to 43%. However, on the hottest summer day, that unfortunately doesn't seem to matter as much. And these are, again, a couple of examples of an MBTA station in Boston, Forest Hills in particular. On the left, you have the walk sheds on a typical summer day. And on the right, you see the same thing for the hottest summer day, where we don't get to see that expansion of walk shed despite increasing greenery. But on the left, because there's already a high level of baseline greenery to begin with, the walk shed really expands significantly upon hypothetically increasing greenery. And there's been similar funding efforts to expand urban greenery in the Boston area as well. The city of Boston received an $11 million grant to enhance the tree canopy within the city. So the key takeaways from this body of work is that we've been able to make improvements on understanding pedestrian behavior at a really minute scale on all fronts, looking at the spatial resolution, the temporal resolution, as well as the sample size of pedestrian route choice studies in the particular. This body of work has been able to advance that. And when we think about the findings and the willingness to walk measures and what does it mean for planning practice and policy, of course, we can, using these measures, we can improve urban design and the built environment in a way that centers pedestrians and thinks about pedestrian comfort and safety. This will also help us calculate pedestrian accessibility to critical destinations like transit in a more realistic manner, and we can compare walkability across cities as well. However, as I'd mentioned, there are some limitations. These are anonymized data, so we cannot compare across socioeconomic groups. And we also need to think about supplementing these big data sources with targeted surveys of underrepresented groups, because we know that app-based or digital ways of collecting data often tend to underrepresent certain demographic groups. As I'd mentioned, this is a body of work. We've published a couple of papers on this already, and there are a couple that are under review. We'll also be presenting this at TRB in January, so hope to see some of you there. And that's all I have. Thank you for your attention, and happy to field any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Basu. That's like a very interesting topic. And do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, I may have one question, Dr. Basu. So you mentioned you have like kind of improved MNL to predict or like to understand the route choice of people, right? I'm just wondering, like, what is your like choice? How do you define your choice that in this scenario?
Yeah, so the data set that we were working with contained the choice that was made, right? The actual choice. So we knew the trip that they took. So we knew the origin, the destination, and the time that they took. So based on that, we constructed several alternative paths from that same origin to the same destination. And then we trimmed the choice set using different decisions, I would say, some of which were based on the literature. For example, we only considered alternatives that were not more than 15% longer than the shortest path, which is something Google Maps also uses. We try to keep the number of turns to a reasonable level. I think that was capped at 3, if I'm not mistaken. and similar caps and thresholds for other variables that helped us bring the choice set down to at most 3 alternatives for every path chosen.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and let's move to our last presentation, I think. So, Dr. Menon, are you online?
Hi, Brian.
Yeah, great. So let me give a quick introduction, and the floor is yours. So Dr. Menon is an assistant professor of civil engineering at Penn State, Harrisburg, working in the area of transportation and urban mobility, especially in emerging mobility, travel behavior, and sustainable cities. Dr. Menon's research is multidisciplinary, multimodal, and involves the application of both quantitative and qualitative approaches and frameworks to address transportation challenges faced in urban and rural environments. Dr. Menon, please go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction, Brian. I am going to share my screen now. Give me a second. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you. So welcome to my presentation. So the topic of the presentation is behavioral intentions to use shared mobility systems post-COVID-19. This is joint work with Dr. Allay from the George Mason University. Now, the context of this current work is COVID-19 and the changes that COVID-19 has brought about in terms of human mobility. Now, we all know that in the past 4 years, there have been a lot of changes in trip making, activity patterns, and travel behavior as a whole. And COVID-19 has also brought about what is also known as reverse migration in some countries in the past 4 years. A lot of conversations around COVID-19 have also looked at changes around human mobility and what are some of the lasting impacts from these changes and how human mobility may have evolved or may want to go back to their pre-COVID, to the pre-COVID trends once COVID is no longer a threat. Another interesting impact with COVID-19 was also that we changed the way we imagine our neighborhoods and communities. We had a lot of initial conversations on sharing spaces and shifting streets, which was an effort that was conducted out of University of North Carolina, where they were documenting all the changes that cities and towns had done to accommodate for somewhat of a normal movement of people in urban and suburban and rural areas. So that led to taking over spaces on the roadway, as well as allocating spaces for open dining and things of that nature. COVID-19 also brought about a lot of changes to some of the business models that we've seen in terms of food delivery services, the emergence of your DoorDash and Uber Eats in some ways is somewhat of a response to the realities that were posed by the pandemic. Now, what we know so far are that vaccines are continuing to be developed for each strain that has been discovered. Now, it's also clear that some aspects of travel have been changed by the pandemic, and they are likely to remain that way in the post-COVID world. For example, some work preferences, some choices around certain modes. But what we don't know in some ways is how many of these changes are going to stick around once the pandemic is no longer a threat, and how many of these will return to to the status quo in some sense. Now, if you look at mobility trends since the pandemic, and this is data from 4 different countries here: United States, United Kingdom, Brazil, and India. And we're looking specifically at transit stations. So this is basically the number of visitors that have used Google Maps to arrive at these particular stations, it is clear to understand that there has been some impact in terms of the pandemic on people's mobility. And as you can see, this is data collected from 2020 till about 2022, and you can see in some cases, such as in India or even Brazil, uh, by the time it was around 2022, you can see there's kind of a reemergence of trips to the pre-COVID levels, and perhaps even more than that around that end of the data collection period. But what is clear is that there have been some changes and some uh, some kind of fluctuation in the number of trips that people have made. Now, shared mobility impacts are a lot more widespread because there have been a lot of conversations around people's perceptions regarding shared mobility systems in the aftermath of the pandemic. Now, a survey done by McKinsey shows that less than 10% of the respondents believe any of these shared mobility modes to be safe, and that is also affecting in many ways the app usage. I mean, the usage of these services across urban and rural regions. And you can see that there is kind of a varying impact in terms of usage. But what is common is that with the variation in impact, there have been challenges for transit agencies and other kinds of operators to attract passengers right back to their systems as they were doing in the pre-COVID period. Now, the data for the current study was collected in 2020, in the summer of 2020, during the peak of the pandemic. Was a comprehensive stated preference survey, which collected not just information since the onset of the pandemic, but also from a time that was before the pandemic and a hypothetical after, which is right about the past year, if one would imagine. The objective was to understand how people's patterns and needs, residential choices, vehicle ownership, mode choice, use of shared mobility systems, and trip making or activity engagement will alter in light of the pandemic. The National Panel of U.S. adults were surveyed in July and August using prime panels. We received responses from all 50 states and Washington, D.C., leading to a final sample size of about 2,400 respondents. Now, here you can see the spread of responses from across the country. We have representation from all states and Washington, D.C., and you can see by the number of respondents at the county level, just to get a brief idea of how much spread there is in terms of the responses. Now, for the main question that pertains to this study, respondents were asked about their frequency of using shared transportation modes for any trip pre-COVID-19. So in the pre-pandemic period, they had the option to talk about all the shared transportation modes, and they were indicating the number of times they roughly used it in the past year. So the options ranged from did not use the mode, had the option but never used it once or twice a year, used it once or twice a month, and so on to the more frequent options. Now, once this was done, they were also asked about their post-pandemic preferences to use these modes. Now, in the post-pandemic period, the likelihood that they would use any of these modes. Now, care was taken to ensure that we set up sort of a baseline for understanding this, and the baseline was the pre-pandemic period. So everyone was asked about the possibilities of using the shared mobility modes, but they were asked to define them in terms of their pre-pandemic period. So basically, that meant that respondents had the option of would not use this mode, use this mode much less than before the pandemic, use this mode less than before the pandemic, so on and so forth until the positive extremes. Now, based on this approach, we were able to track the behavioral intention of users for using these services post-pandemic based on their pre-pandemic behavior. And with that, we've unearthed 5 user profiles that were generated on this context. The first user profile is a non-user by choice. That is someone who will not be utilizing these services post-pandemic, even though they may be available to them in their locality. The second category was non-user by design, who are people that won't be utilizing these services because they don't have these options available to them in the aftermath of the pandemic. The third category is the new user, which is somebody who is just going to start using the service, any shared mobility service post the pandemic period. The fourth one, skeptical user, they will continue to use the service post-pandemic, but they contend that they will use it less frequently than the pre-pandemic period. And the last one is the power user who will continue to use the service post-pandemic, but frequently, more frequently than in the pre-pandemic period. Now, based on these profiles, you can see the distribution of people for using the different shared mobility modes as a function of their pre-pandemic behavior. And what is very interesting is the high incidence of people that are non-users, either by choice or by design. There are those folks who are also skeptical, and then we had to eventually combine power and new users to represent some kind of statistical significance with the data that we were analyzing. But you can see that a large section of people are very reluctant to use some of these options that are available to them in the post-pandemic period. Now, a lot of it may have to do with the timing of the survey, but that's something that we can look at with the findings and with the other implications of this work. Now, as far as the modeling is concerned, 4 multinomial logit models were estimating the behavioral intentions to use shared mobility trips as a function of their pre-pandemic behavior. Some of these shared mobility modes were clubbed together. As you can see, these are the 4 different models that we estimated. Now, the objective was here to understand factors that influence respondents' likelihood to belong to one of those 4 categories. What made a certain kind of a respondent be a power user versus a certain kind of a respondent be a non-user by choice? That was the intention with the modeling framework. For each of the shared mobility mode, a multinomial logit model was estimated, and non-users by design were the base category that was used for each of the models. The factors that we were looking at ranged from individual factors, household factors, built environment factors, tech adoption, and travel behavior and activity in the pre and the since COVID, in the pre and the since COVID timeline. Now let's take a look at the results. Now, before I begin with the results, just to recap, the base is non-user by design, and the colors that are going to be shown are representing each type of user. So the red stands for non-user by choice, the gray stands for a skeptical user, the blue stands for power plus new user, and then you have the pluses and the minuses that stand for someone being more likely to be that person or less likely to be that person. Now, the first set of variables that we investigated were the influence of personal and household level factors. And you can see that there are some wide changes in terms of personal and household level influences on being one of the 4 user categories for the shared, for shared mobility modes post-COVID-19. For example, we can see how Asian respondents indicated that they were more likely to be non-users of choice when it comes to rail. Low-income households expressed greater likelihood that they would be power plus new users of bike share systems, whereas they also expressed less likelihood that they would be a power user of rail or a power user of taxi, potentially indicating that there may be some kind of accessibility challenges with these kind of demographics, perhaps making them more likely to be non-users by design in the process. For high-income folks, you can see again that there's greater reluctance to, greater reluctance on their part to, use rail or even reduce use of rail and taxi services. And you can see for on the right side, you can see how with the education attainment, you can see how highly educated folks are very much likely to be power and new users of rail-based systems, but they were also skeptical of using taxi and taxi services. More household factors, you can see how young households that are households with children that are under the age of 5 years, they were less likely to use rail. And you can see how adult households are more likely to use taxis. Those are households that only have adults in their within their home. Households with senior members, including senior members, people with underlying medical conditions or senior workers, you can see that there is some they're more likely to be non-users by design when it comes to bike share, buses, and rail based systems, and that's something that model results were showing us. Tech adoption was also looked at as a factor here, and you can see how tech enthusiasts are more likely to be skeptical users of buses and bike share systems in the post-COVID realm. You can also see the last one where you see the tech skeptics were also associated with lower likelihood of being power and new users of rail and taxi-based systems. Now, the next set of factors that were investigated were built environment and travel behavior factors. These were all pre-COVID factors that were investigated in this section. Now, the first set of factors here are residential location. So residing in a large city, residing in a suburb, or residing in a small town or rural area, a small city or a town, had varying effects in terms of shared mobility mode usage. What is interesting here is that even though there are significantly positive likelihoods for each user category, it simply shows that residential location has high level of influence in deciding what mode of options are available to you and what mode of options you may not want to use even if they exist around you. Other set of factors, work-related factors, you can see how working in a large working in a large city made you less likely to be a non-user when it comes to bike share, meaning that there is greater chances of those folks engaging in bike share as a mode in their post-COVID futures. Those that had the option to work from home were associated with a higher likelihood of being non-users by choice when it comes to bus, and also being a skeptical user when it comes to rail and bike share systems, perhaps implying that the added flexibility may lead to their lower amount of rides that they may be doing in these kind of modes in the future. Looking at grocery shopping behavior, you can see how long grocery trips that took 30 plus minutes to the store was associated with a greater chance of being a non-user by rail. On the other hand, if you drove alone to the grocery store, you were less likely to be power user of buses or rails in the post-pandemic period. These factors are based on their preferences to use certain transportation modes and services. And this is data from the since COVID period. So you can see how if respondents frequently use transit in the since COVID period, they were associated with greater likelihood of being a power user when it comes to buses, rails, and taxis. But it's also interesting that these same type of people also are associated in different ways with the other parameters, perhaps again indicating the heterogeneity in terms of user choices, user preferences, and eventual behavior when it comes to usage of shared mobility modes. You can see on the right side, people that engaged in a lot of food delivery services since the onset of the pandemic, they were more likely to be power users of bike share systems, whereas people that ordered, frequently ordered online for delivery, they had expressed greater skepticism regarding the use of rail and taxis in the post-pandemic period. The last set of factors here are the trip making and activity participation aspects here, and you can see that engaging in social gatherings was associated with a positive likelihood for being a non-user when it comes to rail. And similarly, there are other influences that you can see here, especially with frequent church and religious visits and frequent sporting event attendances in the since pandemic period associated with larger shares of being non-users by design when it comes to many of these modes, as you can see here. The next set of factors that are looking at that we're looking at are built environment and travel behavioral factors again, but these are the since COVID factors that were estimated in the multinomial logit models. And you can see here, if respondents ended up staying at the same home since the onset of the pandemic, they were likely associated with a greater chance of being a bike share user. Selling and buying household vehicles had influence on shared mobility usage. And also, if you changed a job in the onset since the onset of the pandemic, that led to greater skepticism or greater non-use when it comes to taxi and bike share systems. Again, workplace dynamics were explored to test their influence on the model, and we can see how working in the suburbs was associated with greater chances of being a bike share user, working in going for long commutes since the pandemic, which is 30+ minutes one way, was associated with being a power user for bus systems, whereas having flexibility to work from home and working from home all day was associated with greater reluctance to use bus and rail in the post-pandemic period. Next set of factors, looking at grocery trips. Once again, if you drove alone to the grocery store in the since pandemic period, you were more likely to use rail if rail was available for you as an option. Now, similar transportation usage aspects were looked at, and you can see that if people do not use transit despite its availability, that was associated very significantly with being a non-user by design, with the exception of buses and rail, bus and rail systems that once again show that the non-availability of certain modes or non-usage of certain modes despite availability may have a lot to do with people's actual preferences in the future as well. Now, similarly, you can also see the active modes here. People that were actively using, were frequently using active modes were associated with greater use of bike share systems and taxis as well. If you commuted to work by drive alone in the post-pandemic period, that resulted in greater skepticism among them to use bike share systems. And similarly, you can see how frequently ordering online, grocery, which is something that kicked off in the aftermath of the pandemic, that led to greater chances of being a power user when it came to rail and taxi-based systems. The last set of factors that were looked at, once again, were activity participation. And once again, you can see social gathering, frequent social gathering in the since pandemic period is associated with a greater likelihood of being a power user when it comes to buses. And similarly, you can see how church going, frequent religious gatherings in the aftermath of the pandemic also led to greater skepticism among usage of shared mobility modes in the post-COVID post-COVID period. Now, what are some key takeaways here? You can see that there is limited influence of gender and race ethnicity on shared mode usage. But what is evident is that highly educated individuals are reluctant to use transportation service providers, but they may be potentially interested in using rail transit. Potential equity challenge here is that low education and low income folks are probably being left out of some of these options. And that is something that needs to be that is something that needs to be looked at with greater focus. High income households with more options in the household were less likely to use any of the shared mobility modes. Home location, as we saw earlier, was one of the most vital indicators, specifying that there are specific types of users for each mode in large cities and urban areas. So it's about finding that market segment that uniquely identifies and uniquely embraces that particular option that is available to them. Now, this presents the opportunity to diversify mode options, and that is something that is an implication for future decision making. And with the full recognition that not everybody may even use these options, even if they are available. Transit users most likely continue to using shared mobility modes post-COVID, and that's evident with the influences that we see on drive alone being less likely, and those with workplace flexibility being less likely to use new systems in the aftermath of the pandemic. Frequent out-of-home activity participation, which is basically an indicator based on sporting event attendances, social gatherings, so on and so forth, are associated with less shared mobility mode use. Unless respondents lived in a large city with an alternative mode options and activities, driving was perhaps the only option, which is perhaps why you saw that influence on the sporting and concert venues, and how that was associated with lower incidences of shared mobility usage. What are the implications for policy? Now, one of the key implications for policy remains that shared mobility access continues to drive intentions to adopt and use these modes. And this is perhaps a key that we need to unlock in terms of dismantling these barriers to entry, which will ensure that we have more and more success when we are investing in these kinds of options in our urban areas. Now, governments have a difficult challenge at hand. While a lot of work is currently being done in dismantling the erstwhile mobility-based planning aspects, they need to incorporate mixed use with accessibility-based planning for prioritizing new transportation modes. We have some other studies that we had done looking at shared mobility, shared mobility investments, and how shared mobility investments in urban areas may lead to greater accessibility changes when it comes to job opportunities and education and healthcare, so on and so forth. And this is, again, another study that points to this kind of a focus that we need to adopt in the future. Lastly, it's also important to look at the concerns of the naysayers, the skeptical users, and the non-users by choice. Why are they suggesting that they would use less of the same options, or why are they saying that they will not want to use it at all? And these are concerns that need to be looked at, and they are critical in ensuring widespread public acceptance and market adoption when it comes to these systems. Now, there's a lot of conversation on shared mobility, how the future would look like in the aftermath of the pandemic. And you can see here the two scenarios, the accelerated and the base scenario. But what's unavoidable, or what's what's in some ways undeniable, is that the mobility the mobility landscape around shared mobility usage has forever changed. And now it is an opportunity for studies like these and others to look at this as an opportunity to understand how we can better market these options for more people, and perhaps lead to lasting changes in mobility behaviors and trip making. Now, with that, I want to wrap up, and I want to open the floor for questions if you have some. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Menon. Any questions from the audience? I mean, I have a question here. So it looks like you have done tons of work about like a model development and analytics. So just like maybe I'm sorry, I'm not like quite following all the steps of your like study, but just wondering like how many ML are you developed? Like maybe one pre-COVID and one after COVID, and can you give an overview about like all the models you have done?
Yeah, so we had 5 MNLs that were estimated before. For this particular presentation, I focused on 4 of them. Now, all the MNLs are for the behavioral intention of using shared mobility modes. So depending on each person and where they stand in terms of their mobility usage or mobility preference post-COVID, each model was estimated. So there was one model for bike share systems, there's one model for rail transit, one model for bus transit, and another one for taxis, cabs, Uber, and Lyft together. There was a 5th model which was estimated, which was not found to be very robust, which was, the last option was sharing a ride with a passenger, a co-passenger. we did not really want to continue going ahead with that, but these are the 4 major models that were estimated.
Okay, so both out of the 4 models, you can incorporate like both behavior before and after the pandemic.
Yes. So basically, we created a variable, constructed a variable that basically tracks your behavior from the pre-pandemic and the post-pandemic and assigns you a certain user profile. So that's how the dependent variable is created in some sense, and that's the dependent variable that's used for the modeling of for the modeling.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's all about our presentation today, and thank you everyone for attending the session. And we have learned a lot about like the interesting study in our area. And I think our technical team will make the recording online very soon. So feel free to check out if you have any specific interest. And thank you everyone, and hope to see you next year.
Thank you. Bye everyone.
Bye.